You grew up learning how to disappear. Not physically, not dramatically, but emotionally. You learned to speak in ways that wouldn't interrupt, to feel in ways that wouldn't inconvenience, to exist in ways that wouldn't require too much attention. You weren't ignored outright. You were simply not noticed in the ways that mattered. Your emotions weren't mirrored. Your inner world wasn't explored. Your feelings weren't held long enough to feel real. So you adjusted. You stopped expecting curiosity. You stopped offering too much. You learned to keep things to yourself. And it worked. It worked because it reduced disappointment. It worked because it lowered friction. It worked because needing less felt safer than needing more. That's the paradox. The thing that helped you survive emotionally is now the thing quietly sabotaging your ability to feel alive. What once protected you from rejection now makes connection feel distant. What once kept you from asking too much now leaves you feeling unseen even when people are close. What once felt like maturity now feels like a quiet emptiness you can't quite explain. You might function well. You might be capable, reflective, even self-aware. And yet something inside you feels muted, like you're present in your life, but not fully inhabiting it. You learn how to live without being seen. But a self that adapts to invisibility often forgets how to be real. Growing up emotionally unseen is not the same as growing up unloved. It is growing up unmirrored. In developmental psychology, one of the most critical needs of a child is emotional attunement, the experience of having one's internal states noticed, named, and responded to. When a caregiver reflects a child's emotions back to them, the child learns, my inner world exists. It makes sense. It matters. When this attunement is absent, the child adapts. This often leads to emotional neglect, not as an act of cruelty, but as an omission. No one is overtly harmful. They are simply unavailable, distracted, overwhelmed, or emotionally immature. Another core concept here is avoidant adaptation. When emotional bids are not met, the child learns to reduce them. Feelings become quieter. Needs become smaller. Expression becomes selective. The nervous system reorganizes around self-containment. Neurologically, this affects how the brain integrates emotion and identity. The default mode network, responsible for self-referential processing, develops without consistent external validation. Instead of forming a cohesive sense of self through relational feedback, the child builds identity internally, often in isolation. This can also involve dissociation, not in its extreme form, but as subtle detachment. The child learns to stay functional by stepping slightly away from their emotional experience. You don't stop feeling. You stop registering that your feelings deserve attention. Over time, this becomes a pattern of emotional self-silencing. You don't ask, what am I feeling? You ask, is this worth bringing up? And slowly, the inner world becomes something private, vague, and difficult to access. This is not resilience. It is adaptation to absence. And adaptations formed early tend to persist long after the environment changes. The deepest cost of growing up emotionally unseen is not loneliness. It is unreality. When no one consistently reflects your inner world, you begin to doubt its validity. You wonder whether your feelings are too much, too vague, or simply irrelevant. You learn to question your own experience before anyone else can. This creates an invisible grief. Grief for conversations that never happened. Grief for questions no one asked. Grief for the version of you that might have emerged if someone had been curious enough to stay. The philosopher Martin Buber wrote about the difference between I-it and I-thou relationships. To be truly seen, to be met as a thou, is to have one's subjectivity acknowledged. Growing up emotionally unseen often means living in an I-it world, functional, transactional, but not deeply relational. The core fear that forms is not rejection. It is exposure without recognition. The fear that if you reveal yourself, nothing will meet you there. So you protect yourself. You keep emotions abstract. You intellectualize instead of feeling. You stay composed instead of vulnerable. You may sacrifice authenticity for belonging, not by changing who you are, but by dulling yourself enough to fit. Simple moments become complicated. You hesitate before sharing joy. You minimize sadness. You struggle to articulate what you want because you're not sure anyone is listening. And over time, this creates a quiet despair. Not dramatic, not loud, but persistent. Carl Jung spoke of neurosis as the suffering of soul that has not discovered its meaning. For the emotionally unseen child, the suffering often comes from not knowing whether their inner life has meaning at all. You learn to live without being reflected. But reflection is how the self takes shape. And without it, something essential goes missing. This pattern does not remain in childhood. It follows you into adulthood. You might recognize it in your relationships. You struggle to feel truly known, even when people are kind. You share selectively, cautiously. You often feel closer to people in your head than in real life. You may feel disappointed after opening up, not because someone hurt you, but because the response didn't quite land. You might avoid conflict, not out of fear, but out of resignation. You assume being understood will require too much effort, so you adjust instead. At work, you may understate your contributions. You wait to be noticed rather than advocating for yourself. You feel uncomfortable drawing attention to your inner process. Internally, you may feel disconnected from desire. When asked what you want, you hesitate. Not because you don't want things, but because wanting was never something that felt witnessed or supported. You might intellectualize emotions, analyze them, explain them, keep them at a safe distance. You might feel oddly invisible even when surrounded by people. These are not personality flaws. They are coping strategies. Strategies formed when emotional presence was unreliable. The first step of unlearning is witnessing without judgment. Noticing when you minimize. Noticing when you go quiet. Noticing when you assume you won't be met. And instead of blaming yourself, you ask, what did this protect me from? This reframes the pattern. You are not bad at connection. You adapted to emotional absence. And adaptations can change. Healing from emotional invisibility begins with being seen by yourself first. This is where inner child reparenting becomes essential. It is the practice of offering curiosity, validation, and presence to your own inner states, of asking yourself the questions no one asked you before, and staying for the answers. It also involves choosing softness where you once chose self-containment, allowing yourself to express emotions before they are fully formed, letting others see you in process, not just in conclusion. Shadow work plays a role here as well, reintegrating the parts of you that learn to stay quiet, to stay vague, to stay small. These parts are not weak. They are protective. The philosopher Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Live the questions now." Healing is learning to live your inner life openly, even when answers don't arrive immediately. You don't need to become louder. You don't need to become different. You need to become present. Present with your feelings. Present with your needs. Present with the reality that your inner world deserves space. You are never invisible because you lack substance. You were invisible because no one stayed long enough to see. Now you can. And that is how the pattern breaks. If this resonated, consider sharing it, not as advice, but as recognition. Because sometimes the most healing thing is realizing that what felt like emptiness was actually the echo of being unseen. You're not broken. You are unmirrored. And now, gently, you're learning to see yourself. The goal was never to be fixed. The goal was to finally exist, fully, honestly, and without apology.